Hello, good afternoon. I'm Rachel Patton, Executive Director of Preserve Arkansas. Preserve Arkansas is the statewide nonprofit advocate for historic preservation. Welcome to Women in Preservation, the webinar series that features women who are working to save Arkansas's historic places. Thank you to our series sponsor, DMX Architecture of Fayetteville. Many of you are already members of Preserve Arkansas, and we thank you for your generous support. If you're not already a member, I'd like to invite you to join us for as little as $50 a year. Your memberships provide vital support to our organization and allow us to continue the important work of saving Arkansas's historic places. Preserve Arkansas is now seeking nominations for the 2023 Arkansas Preservation Awards. The awards recognize outstanding preservation achievements, people who've made a difference in their communities, and projects that inspire others to protect Arkansas's special historic places. Nominations are due by 5 p.m. on August 31st. You can learn more and nominate on our website at preservearkansas.org. Join us on September the 12th for our next Women in Preservation talk by Antoinette Johnson, owner of Johnson Consulting, Historic Preservation and Interior Design. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Britin Bostick. Britin is a sixth-generation Texan whose family was there before it was a state. She grew up ranching in the Texas Hill Country, a place with so few cities that it's a great irony she is now a city planner. Britin accidentally fell into historic preservation during the 2009 recession and has never looked back, transitioning her architecture and construction career with a Master of Science in Community and Regional Planning and a Master of Public Affairs in 2016. As the downtown and historic planner for the city of Georgetown, Texas, she oversaw development review, compliance, and programming for 2 local historic districts and more than 1,300 locally designated historic properties. During the COVID pandemic, she started a web series called Tuesday Talks with Britin and Ann to share local history, and she project managed the first substantial update to the local historic district's design guidelines. Since the beginning of 2022, Britin has served as the long-range planner and special projects manager for the city of Fayetteville, Arkansas, where she oversees the historic preservation program and supports the city's 2 historic commissions, in addition to several other projects. Fayetteville has just completed its first citywide heritage and historic preservation plan, and several action items are already underway. Welcome, Britin.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel, and for inviting me to do this. I'm so excited. Anytime I get to talk about my work is a really good day. And it's really wonderful, honestly, to be in Arkansas. Since I'm not an Arkansas native, I've had to rely on a lot of people to help me get to know Fayetteville better and to know our stories better. So I'm glad to be able to share some of that today, but also give a little bit of how I got here in the first place. So always have to check, even after we've been doing this for a few years. Can you see my screen?
It all looks great.
Great, thank you so much. So I'll get started by kind of saying I am an accidental preservationist. I did not ever intend to be in historic preservation when I started my career in architecture and construction project management. I was working for a firm in Paris, Texas. So Rachel showed a picture of me in Paris, France, but I worked for quite a while in Paris, Texas, and I was very focused on building new things. I've designed, bid, and built over $250 million worth of new construction projects. That was all before I was 28 years old. It was a busy time before the recession, not so busy during and kind of shortly following. And so I found myself working for a company that was doing a lot of federal work, which is where I got introduced to the Section 106 process. And then I was also working for a company that had quite a bit of land holdings in the historic downtown Paris. And it became my job to oversee those properties and see what we could do to bring them back to life. So basically, I'll, in the course of this presentation, answer these 4 questions. How did I get into preservation? What does my work look like? What are my favorite stories? And then what makes me continue on with it, since I'm definitely not going back. So this is me as a baby preservationist. Kind of during the recession, I'm standing in the Hotel Gibraltar and installing our very first building permit in the window. The Hotel Gibraltar is a 1915 hotel constructed with what was at the time this new technology of concrete structure. It had concrete columns, it had concrete floors and a roof. It was clad in brick. By the time I got to it, the entire hotel had been completely stripped of its interior finishes. The only thing that remained were partial sections of the mosaic tile floor. There was a little bit of marble wainscot left in the basement that had all been removed from the first and second floors. There was no lighting. There was almost no plaster left. There were no interior walls. There was no flooring above the first floor. And all of the original windows have been replaced by vinyl windows, which you can see me sticking my finger into with some tape here. And so really where I began to fall in love with historic buildings was by working in them. It was my job to document almost 3 blocks worth of historic buildings that were in pretty terrible condition. For kind of, I think most people's thinking about them, but for me, they became these like really beautiful, wonderful things that were layered with history and interest. It looked like the walls were bare on the insides, but when I looked a little more closely in corners, I was finding layers of wallpaper with fox hunting scenes and these beautiful patterns and colors that had been almost lost to time. And so this hotel ultimately wasn't restored. It was basically just stabilized, and that was what we got the work permits to do. But funny enough, that ended up getting me on the Main Street Board for Paris, Texas, and then also on the Historic Preservation Commission there. And I learned for the first time what it was like to be a historic commissioner. And I ended up realizing that even though I could put a building together and take it back apart again, I didn't really know the context of the work that I was doing in historic preservation and on the Main Street Board. And I really wanted to learn a lot more about the context of buildings, the placemaking that I was trying to do and that I really didn't have the tools for. So that ended up in me getting a couple of degrees. That was also somewhat accidental, honestly. I went for a planning degree, and I ended up with a planning degree with a specialization in historic preservation and a Master of Public Affairs, because I found out 3 weeks into my graduate program for one more degree, it would only take me 1 more year, and that seemed like a heck of a deal. By the time I graduated, I had my own consulting firm with a colleague of mine from school. And we got busy on Old Taylor High, which is the historic high school in Taylor, Texas, just to the northeast of Austin. Old Taylor High has become quite a project. This is at this point a fully leased out property. It's a very large campus in the middle of town. Taylor is most recently known for being the site of a Samsung semiconductor plant. So the mayor of Taylor, Texas, and the mayor of a city in Korea have a very new but kind of blossoming relationship and kind of trade representatives in kind of working through Samsung and their manufacturing and the impacts to the community, but also the relationship that that's provided to the international manufacturing community for Taylor, which for its entire history has been a very small rural place in Texas. So right before all of that happened, the owners of this property engaged in a total site rehabilitation and got a bunch of tax credits for it, which is pretty amazing. So I do get the honor of saying I've worked on a tax credit project. This had both state and federal tax credits in Texas. And so this is the outside before we got started. You can see pretty typically they had removed all of the windows and doors by that point and replaced them with pretty typical aluminum windows and doors. And so part of what we were working on was not replacing windows for the main building because that was going to be too expensive. And it was kind of an odd mix. Some things had been left almost entirely intact. Like this beautiful auditorium with all of the seating, with the lighting, with the plaster, that's all original. The only thing that had been replaced were the windows. And then a lot of the classrooms still had original wood floors. They still had pretty substantial amounts of plaster and really just the replacement of the windows had happened. So it was pretty easily able to qualify for the National Register. And then a lot of the work that my client was doing was to make repairs rather than replacing anything that they could. And they self-performed a lot of the work. They got the kids involved, they got the grandparents involved. This was very much a family project. The campus included a gymnasium, which has this beautiful cast stone detailing, which I really enjoyed. When my client got hold of the property, there was no air conditioning in the gymnasium. Those are the original maple floors, which is pretty fun. It had a beautiful truss system for the roof, also replacement of the windows and doors. So that presented a few challenges for us, but ultimately they were able to repurpose this into an event center. Having the floors refinished, but leaving them intact, there was a little bit of repair needed. And other than installing some ductless mini splits to be able to condition the space, not a whole lot of changes were made beyond repainting those walls. And unfortunately, the Pac-Man had to go. One of the biggest parts of this project, and one of the most complicated from the tax credit perspective, was there was kind of an accessory classroom building that had been built later on after the primary buildings on the campus. And so this was the band hall and some additional classrooms that they had built for additional capacity in the 1950s. And the band hall still had some of the original windows. These were really great aluminum windows that the glass was almost falling out of. Turns out in a couple of places, they had replaced the glass panes with plexiglass. It's probably a lot easier to do, probably considered safer because these panes were kind of puttied into place. So my job in particular on this project was to draw replica windows as closely as we could possibly get them, because they had replaced entire sections of these windows in the longer kind of length of the building that stretched from the band hall further to the edge of the property. So everywhere you see kind of this cut out with the two kind of, vinyl builder windows in, that used to be an entire section of aluminum windows. And so our goal for the tax credit part of the project was to get those replaced and get those fully functioning. This building became an apartment complex with a restaurant in it, which is a really incredible mixed use rehabilitation. Super fun to work on, but also pretty complicated. So here are my replica windows that I drew and had manufactured. We were pretty proud of the results, but it was also pretty nerve-wracking to have to get all of those measured, manufactured, and fit. They were incredibly expensive. I think we spent well over $100,000 just on window replacements to get those back. But once we did, we had 12 one-bedroom apartments that were almost immediately leased up. So that was pretty fun. And the site's just been really successful with their ability to lease everything out, especially now that Samsung's in Taylor. There's a lot more economic activity there, and this project has really been able to take advantage of that. The timing almost couldn't have been better. We did complete the project in the 2 years that you have to complete it. And this has turned out to be something that I'm just kind of amazed I got to be part of. Something that was also really important to this project, and that sometimes is the case with historic preservation work. This one was really challenging because the school had, my client acquired the building from the school district directly. And so when they decided to abandon this campus, it was in the middle of a residential neighborhood. There were a few churches fairly nearby, but nothing else very close. And for them to use it as a commercial site meant that they had to have the zoning changed. And so what they could have done under the entitlement they purchased the property with is knock down all of the historic buildings and built 24 single family homes on the property, just a regular subdivision. It wouldn't have required a lot of paperwork, and it wouldn't have required going to the city council. But they really wanted to save the property, and we had to find a way to make that work with the city's zoning. And so this is before I became a municipal employee. This is when I was on the private side of things, but we ended up, it took us about probably 9 months to work with the city to figure out a solution. There it was called a planned unit development. Here in Arkansas, I think we call them planned zoning districts, or PZDs. We basically custom built a zoning district specifically for this campus that could satisfy what the neighborhood was trying to get out of it, what my clients were trying to get out of it, and what I think one of the best things was instead of having to pave over the entire front lawn, we got to keep it completely intact. And it was so great to have the neighborhood show up to our city council meeting and say, we don't want a parking lot. This is the neighborhood's front yard. It's been the neighborhood's front yard for the entire history of this school, and we really want to keep that. So they didn't want additional parking requirements to have to be in place so that we could protect about 38,000 square feet of front lawn for the school. So that was, I think, a big win for everybody. And as much as there were a lot of concerns about what parking conditions would be if we didn't have those huge parking lots, it's really ended up working out well. And there's a lot of street parking around the site available to accommodate it. So a couple of years after I finished that project, I went to work for the city of Georgetown, Texas. They were short a historic preservation planner, and I thought that would be a really fun time to transition to the public sector and get some experience on that side. And boy, was I right. So as much as I kind of accidentally fell into historic preservation, I feel like I also kind of accidentally fell into being a municipal employee, and it's turned out that I like this very much. So this is Georgetown, Texas in 1885. What's really unusual about this photo is this large column in the back near where the 5 is at the top of the photo. That is a 100-foot water tower. It was built using the same technology as the Eiffel Tower, but it was built earlier than the Eiffel Tower was built. And that remained in Georgetown until the 1960s, when it was finally in such bad condition they chose to demolish it. But Georgetown, Texas, for a long time had a 100-foot water tower dead in the middle of it. What you can also see in the background to the right is the Williamson County 4th courthouse. Georgetown has had 5 county courthouses, that being the 4th. That was this beautiful, I think, I'm probably going to get this wrong. Somebody's welcome to correct me. I think it was something like a French Second Empire style. And they tore it down because ultimately the county commissioners decided the building wasn't big enough. And so in 1910, a new courthouse was built, and that's the courthouse that still stands there today. So it's always remarkable to me, the periods of time in which people were kind of tearing these things down that today would be very precious and very special to us. But I think it's a little bit with the ethic that I grew up with, which is I'm from a place with a lot of scarcity. I'm from a place with a lot of poverty and not a lot of resources. And so when you got to have something new, it was like a very special and very desirable thing. And we didn't necessarily keep old things unless it was out of necessity. And so historic preservation is kind of a funny thing to me because I definitely didn't grow up with that in mind. I grew up with new was the very, very special, desirable thing. And so now that I work to protect and preserve old things, it's kind of funny to me. But it's also, just kind of a reflection, I think, of our community values and also how we experience change, especially in cities as we go forward. Most of the buildings you see in this photo are no longer there. Definitely the chicken houses and the outhouses are gone. A lot of those homes are also no longer there. But some of them still are, and definitely a couple of the buildings on the square you can see in the background, but not the courthouse. It's a new courthouse now. So I ended up having a somewhat viral photo of my first day of work. I started with the city of Georgetown in September of 2019, and I had just seen a rash of back to school photos with all these chalkboards with my friends and their kids. And I thought, I'm going to do that too, but for my new job. And that ended up kind of going crazy on social media very unexpectedly. And I had a number of people say that they were going to start copying that, which I thought was pretty fun. But that job really was a lot about not only building community around historic preservation, but building trust in historic preservation. Historic preservation is often a very contentious practice. It's often contentious work because we don't all share the same value. We don't all share the same ethic about historic places. And so when those things come in conflict with each other, it can be really challenging for neighborhoods, for neighbors, for community members. And Georgetown had had some pretty significant conflicts over proposed demolitions, over some properties that had additions that a lot of the neighbors thought were incompatible. So I walked into a job where there had been a lot of hard feelings, and where the council had at one point in time threatened to disband the historic commission. And that was not too long before I kind of arrived in the role. And it was really important to me to show people that historic preservation was a positive thing, that it didn't need to always be contentious, and that there was a lot of value for the community there, and that the advocates for historic preservation really knew what they were talking about when they said it was important for Georgetown. Georgetown's been in the list of some of the fastest growing cities in America for several years now. And all of that growth was putting a lot of pressure on the city. So you had a lot of people saying, we need to tear these things down to make way for more people. And really, there was so much identity in those historic places that as Georgetown was growing rapidly, it was important to maintain that identity so that people felt connected to their own community. And that was the basis for a lot of the work that I did. We talk about women in historic preservation here. So I wanted to point out, even though that's not a lady wearing the hard hat in the background of the photo, the dome that's sitting on top of that building, that's the old Masonic Lodge on the square in Georgetown, Texas. You can see the new courthouse, the 1910 courthouse there on the left with its copper dome. But this dome was the replacement dome on the Masonic Lodge. It was installed in 1985. And this is a really interesting one. So the Masonic Lodge had an onion dome originally. It was built around 1901. And there were stories in the paper about when the building was constructed, it was only partially finished when the Galveston hurricane that killed so many people blew into the Texas coast. And a lot of the effects from the hurricane were felt inland as far as the Austin area. And so this dome had been on the building for a couple of years and it disappeared one night. Just flat disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to it. We could never find any records of it. We couldn't figure out who would have known where it went or why. And so the building remained domeless for over 50 years. It ended up kind of being reinstalled with a close replica, not an exact replica, but a close replica out of a catalog from a company, I believe in Kentucky in 1985. And by the time that I got into this role, I was working with the property owner on some long-term water damage to the building because of the way the dome had been installed. And all those decades of water leaking around that tower had done quite a bit of damage to the structure. So we had to do some structural repairs while the dome was removed. And you can imagine this was very iconic in Georgetown. This is one of the most photographed buildings on the square next to the courthouse. So taking off the dome for a few months to get a replacement done and then to also do the structural repair that was needed was something that a lot of people were very sensitive to. But it was important to communicate that not only was that not the original dome, it was not a historic dome by any stretch of the imagination. And then the dome that was being put back was exactly the same dome, but with new paint. And what's great is the same company that had produced the 1985 dome was still in business. And so they were able to make a new one, but one that had a lot better stormwater management kind of built into the piece. And so that arrived with a crane, the same way that this one was pulled off. And that was one that I was glad to have a good relationship with the owner because they let me up on the roof to watch it myself. So I became known during COVID as the Britin of Tuesday Talks with Britin and Ann. This is my colleague. Ann and I love historic preservation, if you can't tell. And this is us celebrating National Historic Preservation Month. We did a series where we would hop online and do a live Facebook cast, and then the videos would be put on YouTube. And we would talk about Georgetown's history, and we would show all kinds of maps and we would show photos. Ann had worked for the county museum for a period of time. And at this point in time, she was working for the library. So she and I were colleagues at the city. And it was basically an hour once a week for us to have a good time talking about stories we found interesting. So we told railroad stories, we told ghost stories, we talked about women in construction, we talked about women's achievements. It was great fun. Once in a while, we got really lucky and we could kind of Zoom interview somebody so that we could have guests on our show. And this is all while we were staying socially distant and doing a lot of things online that we were accustomed to doing in person. So I think we're still on YouTube. I think Tuesday Talks with Britin and Ann lives on. So if you're ever really curious about Georgetown, Texas history, please feel free to look that up. We used to laugh about having 12 followers on YouTube. But it was really a fun way to share the value of historic preservation with our community, as I was also working through making sure people were following all of the rules around historic preservation that needed to be followed. And we did have quite a bit of development pressure on the historic districts while I was there. So in those 1,300 protected properties, I was doing, a few dozen reviews a month, and it was everything from actual paint color changes, because we did have some properties that required that level of review. But some of the properties were getting new garages or garage additions. People might need additional living space on their houses, or they might be looking to demolish a really important historic building. And I would do a lot of the research to understand what the history was and make the case for why staff was or wasn't supporting the proposed demolition. In most cases, we were not. Once in a while, the building did kind of merit a demolition because of its condition. But what was nice is that I had the ability to recommend to the Historic Commission that they require the property be documented before demolition was approved. And so we had a great record. And with Anne being my colleague in the library, we were able to transmit those documents to the public library and make all of that publicly available, which was a really successful way to mitigate any of the losses that we had through approved demolitions. Even though there weren't that many, it was still important to have that available to us. So here's one of the stories that we told, and really one of my favorite stories because it's a little bit unusual from my experience, but we like to tell the story of Maddie Cody. So this was Martha Rebecca Hughes Cody. We almost always told stories about women who had multiple names, which got a little bit challenging at times. But she was born even before the Civil War, and she lived to be almost 100 years old. She was the daughter of a very prestigious man in Georgetown, and she was married to one of the most beloved people at Southwestern University in Georgetown. And so she was the first woman that I was able to identify had filed her own subdivision plat. Now, if you're not familiar with subdivision plats, it's the way that we legally subdivide property. Usually for the purposes of development, but it's often taking a larger tract and breaking it into smaller tracts to individually sell or maybe to individually develop. And so she basically took her inheritance, made really good use of it, and then passed that on to her sons. And from what I was able to tell, her family was very successful in the medical field, including her grandchildren and some great grandchildren. So she really set her family up for success, it looks like. So to do a presentation like this, I would have gone through plat records. I would have looked at public records and tried to find anything I could. And funny enough, when I was introduced to Maddie Cody, I wasn't sure that it was a woman. It took a little bit additional research to figure out that it was Martha that the Maddie came from. But she even signed her plat Maddie. That's how she went. So in 1925, she took property she had inherited from her father. She subdivided it into multiple lots. And I was like, this is so cool. This is a beautifully drawn and written plat. This is really wonderful. How interesting. And then I did a little more research and found out the story was way more than I thought. So hopefully you're all familiar with the Sanborn fire insurance maps, but these are maps of cities across the United States that span a variety of year periods. And in Georgetown, we had several. In Fayetteville, we also have Sanborn maps, and I'm thrilled to be able to use them in my work. But what the Sanborn map showed was that in 1916, in the map section I have in color on the left, there was a very, very large stone and wood house on the property that she had platted. This is about 9 years before she filed the plat. It turned out this was her father's house. And her father's house was enormous. It was built kind of during the Civil War. And it turns out, because my colleague Anne was such a good researcher and so good at finding fun stories, they'd had to pause construction on the house for a period of time. And we thought it was because of the Civil War and maybe nobody was around to build it. It turns out it was from an epidemic of yellow fever, and they stopped building the house and indeed started taking part of it apart because they had to build coffins to bury people because so many people were dying of this epidemic. And there's quite a number of instances of yellow fever epidemics in Texas in the 19th century, and this is one of them. But her father's property, even though it was in the middle of town, was really huge. He had his own block. So she took all of that and cut it up. And it turns out, as you'll kind of slide over to the right, by 1940, I found that there was a gas station and apartments where her father's house had been. And I thought, who tears down their dad's house and builds a gas station and apartments? This is like very anti-historic preservation kind of stuff, right? So I asked Anne if she could help me find a photo of the house, because this was a very, very grand house from all indications. And the only photo that we were able to find was the front porch. This was taken during, I believe, kind of some kind of celebration of kind of America. This is just the front porch of the house. You can see these huge windows, this huge porch with several people on it, big stone stairs, big stone columns. And so they're all dressed up very patriotically, not because they're dressed in their period of time, but they were apparently reenacting some kind of period in American history. They were either celebrating 1776 or something to that effect. And so even though this was the only photo we've ever been able to locate, it definitely gives you an idea of the scale of the house, I think really successfully. So it was quite something. I'll zoom in on the house here, because what's funny is that Maddie's house is the house directly to the right. So you see the house that I've got with the red box around it was the house that got torn down to make way for the new construction. But Maddie's house and her sister's house were kind of next door, just to the east. These sisters, they didn't marry brothers. They married two very different gentlemen, but they lived next door to each other for their entire adult lives. And so the family remained very close, at least the sisters did. I'm assuming they agreed to what Maddie did, but that was her sole inheritance, not her sister's. So I'm not entirely sure. But there's a close-up of the gas station and apartment buildings that were built right there on kind of the main east-west road through town. And thankfully, I had a few historic photos that I could grab for this. They weren't very clear, but this is from, I think, around 1934. There was a flyover of Georgetown. And so this is what I was able to see of what she built. Her house is directly to the left of that red box. It's a little bit harder to see. Her sister's house was a little more grand than hers was. But then thankfully, we do historic resource surveys, and we have photos that capture what things look like in specific periods of time. And Georgetown had a historic resource survey done in 1984, and I was able to see what the apartments look like. And it was kind of a gift, right, that somebody had had the foresight to do this survey for me. So if you ever wonder if a historic resource survey is worth it, the answer is always yes. We definitely want to do those. They're sometimes one of the most important ways that we can find out what things used to look like, especially if you come into a new role in a new city and you're trying to understand a little bit better what the past historic context was. Hard for me to do a presentation without talking about cats in historic preservation. If you've ever taken the time to look through newspaper articles from the past, you can find some really fun little notes about cats. And so these are all from the 1870s, 1860s, little articles talking about places where cats were, or kind of places where, in one case, ketchup or catsup appeared when I was doing this search. But one of the funnier is this 1989 newspaper article that talked about a cat case being reported in the paper. And this is in the Georgetown paper, but it had come all the way from Baltimore, Maryland, where there was a kind of a valuable cat. It was a Maltese, which had basically been missing, and the real owner found that it had been living with a different owner. They went to court over who owned the cat, and the judge decided in favor of the original owner, although the original owner had to pay the kind of temporary owner room and board for the cat for the period of time in which the cat had been missing, which is quite fun. There was a very famous newspaper editor, postmaster, just kind of general civic-minded man named John Sharp in Georgetown. And it turns out, again, my colleague Anne, always coming through, John Sharp had written a poem about a cat. And so it basically, he's talking about his own cat and kind of characterizing his cat as being this lazy, good for nothing orange cat, as orange cats are. But then basically, when it was time for dinner, the cat would appear. And so some of these writings and some of these collections are so important when we're doing research and trying to understand what was our community like. It's really sometimes easier to look at the buildings and say that that's the story of your community. But people's attitudes toward cats are also an aspect of your community's history that can be important and also really funny to share and relate with people. So it wasn't all play in Georgetown. I did actually have to do a lot of work. And so one of the projects that I did there that I think is particularly meaningful in historic preservation work, because it's almost rare to get to do this, right, is I got to work on a complete update of our design guidelines. When I was working for the city, our design guidelines were about 20 years old. I've found that 20 years old is about the time that people kind of end their patience on something and need to redo it. Sometimes it's 10 years, oftentimes 20 years is, okay, we've got to look at this again. 20 years, it's been too long. So we looked at overhauling our design guidelines. And I say that we focused on three things: changes to the format, what the document looked like, changes to the content, what all was included, and changes to the requirements. And that's obviously usually the most contentious one, because that's the one that impacts property owners the most. And that's where, if you don't have great communication, you can really get yourself into a sticky situation when you're talking about the way that property is regulated. And so we wanted something that was a lot easier to navigate. We went from probably 14 chapters to 5. A lot of the feedback from our design guidelines users was that they were just having a hard time navigating the document. And it had been well written and it had been written by a very experienced consultant. But at the same time, we just really needed something that was easier for our community to navigate, even our homeowners. So it's not just like experienced, sophisticated developers. A lot of our historic properties were just people's homes. And when they needed to go through the approval process, they needed something that they could use really successfully as well. So I spent a lot of time communicating to people what it is that we were trying to do. So for example, when we're looking at commercial infill or new construction that was coming into the commercial part of downtown, we were trying to get them to do building elements that matched with the existing elements. So there was a base, middle, and cap for all of our buildings, pretty traditional design. A lot of our structures were from the 19th century, not the 20th century. And so we were trying to not have people recreate late 19th century buildings, but we were trying to kind of mimic the stylistic elements so that things fit nicely within their context. So we wanted buildings with cornices, we wanted vertical upper windows, we wanted traditional materials. The historic commissioners there really weren't big fans of EIFS or exterior insulated finish systems. There's a visual difference between EIFS and stucco, and they really wanted to see stucco, so they held pretty firm on that. We did want to see storefronts on the ground floor. We had a great tradition of that. And we also wanted canopies and awnings. It's hot in Texas. And so we wanted people to have shade. And also it was a great building design element. So here we have a completely different set of buildings. These are from the 1920s and 30s, but you can see the reddish brick building toward the right. That was a new building, and that was built with many of these elements in mind. That base, middle, and cap element, even though it was a bit taller than the historic buildings, we wanted it to be in a traditional building module. Again, vertical upper floor windows, storefronts, canopies, and awnings. Trees were always getting in my way. We're in Fayetteville. Trees always get in my way of photos here too. Kind of a common problem, but it's a good problem to have, right? Because you want those trees, but sometimes they make it a little bit hard to take photos of buildings. So overall, we ended up with a new title, cover pages, and images. That was pretty exciting. We also reduced the chapters, like I said, from 14 down to 5. We just went really simple. If you're in downtown area 1, the core of the square, here's your rules. Downtown area 2, Old Town, which was the residential sector, a special chapter for demolition and relocation of buildings, and then one specifically for signs. Signs were a really big deal for us. We had a lot of conflict over signs and what the sign rules are. So we tried to make that as simple and clear as possible while getting the regulations that we needed. And by the time we rewrote these design guidelines, we had a lot of new sign illumination technology that had not at all been addressed in the old guidelines. So people were wanting to use lighting in new ways that had not been available when the original guidelines were written. And we really had to do a lot of work to update our code to, not only address what people are wanting to do today, but also what they're going to be wanting to do in the future. That was one of the more challenging aspects, was getting a good handle on the lighting. We also had a lot of people asking, what kind of house do I have and what do I need to do? So we put in a lot of illustrations of architectural styles as a guide for our community, just so that they could understand what kind of style house they might have and how to best work with it. So the consultant did a lot of work on that, and that ended up being kind of one of the highlights of the project and something that was really well received. We did a lot of other work that kind of goes into it. Typical stuff for Secretary of the Interior standards. We did prohibit vinyl and aluminum siding. That was something that was pretty hotly debated, and ultimately where the commission wanted to make a recommendation to the council. And what was really great is the council agreed with that recommendation. So those two bodies went from having a pretty contentious relationship to a pretty successful collaborative one. That was really great. And then we talked a lot about architectural styles, materials, porches, fences, things like that. And we didn't have a lot of criteria for what to do if somebody, excuse me, wanted a demolition. And so you'd say, well, just no demolition. But the reality was that we had some buildings that didn't need to stay with us any longer. And it was a lot better to be able to have a documentation requirement than to completely lose any ability to mitigate the loss of that building. And that was something that we worked on quite a bit, and I was really pretty proud of the outcome for. So let me take a quick sip and I'll pivot to what I do in Fayetteville. Rachel was kind enough to mention that Fayetteville's just completed its very first historic preservation plan. This was great fun, and I'm so grateful to the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program. They provided us with a certified local government grant to be able to do this work. And so thank you to them for helping make this possible. The Fayetteville City Council adopted this document on July 6th of this year, so it's barely a month old. And we are busy looking at implementation items, also, as Rachel said. So this is just a screenshot of the webpage. If you'd like to see it, it's pretty easy to get to. You can go to fayetteville-ar.gov and just type in Historic Preservation Plan in the search bar. We've got some videos. We've got some additional documents from our planning process. And we had a lot of community involvement. I was honestly really pleasantly surprised, not because I didn't think that Fayetteville would be involved, but we are one of the communities in Arkansas that's a certified local government program that does not have the local ordinance districts that you usually have to have. We have one. It's the White Hanger at Drake Field. And so that's a municipally owned property. That's not a privately owned property. We don't have any kind of neighborhood local districts, and we're really working toward that. But at the moment, Fayetteville hasn't been a big taker on that. As many rules as we have, we haven't had people want to undergo that process yet. So it's definitely something that we need to work on and we'll be working on. But we've got 52 action items in our plan, and we've got kind of five big overarching goals that we're reaching toward. Strengthening our existing preservation program. We've got 2 historic commissions that work really hard to serve the community and do effective and successful historic preservation work. We've also gone on here to encourage compatible development that prioritizes historic preservation. That's a super important one, as you all know. Identify and protect historic properties. And here's my favorite part: by utilizing historic resource surveys and designations. I talked about how big a fan I am of historic resource surveys. I really hope I'm going to have the chance to do a citywide one in Fayetteville. That would be exciting and excellent. 4, provide learning opportunities for the community. Our community wants to know more. They want the stories, but they also want the technical information. They want the workshops. We have a lot of stone retaining walls in Fayetteville, a lot of historic stone retaining walls, and they're actually one of our most requested technical support kind of queries is like, can you help me understand what to do with this wall? Usually over a certain period of time, they'll get to the point that the walls might be leaning or they might need repair or maintenance work. And so we get a lot of, not only a lot of value for those walls, but we get a lot of questions about them. And then also promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and protect cultural heritage. We have a lot of cultural groups in Fayetteville that want to be represented in this work. And that's everyone from our Black community to our queer community. And so we're looking at ways to identify and celebrate them in this work that we're doing as well. And you can't do a plan in Fayetteville without going to the farmers market. So we definitely went to the farmers market with this one. We asked people, what do you want us to do as we implement this plan? What's important to you? What do you want us to tackle first? Please help us rank and prioritize these items. And boy, did they. We got over 3,000 votes in our survey ultimately, which is kind of amazing. People like to vote with colored dots very, very much. And it was nice to have all ages able to vote in this way. We had little kids wanting to vote, you know, can I put the sticker on it? And their parents would say, well, let me tell you which one. And the kids were like, no, I'm going to put where I want. And for some reason, all the little boys wanted to vote in red. And so sometimes we would have groups of young people, maybe college students, come through and they would all want to vote in the same color, maybe yellow. And some people would say, can I, how many colors can I vote in? And so that was pretty fun. But it was a great way for us to capture our community's values for historic preservation and get some specifics. So this is something I'm actually bringing to our Historic District Commission in a couple of days, I guess this Thursday. We'll be talking about rankings and prioritization and how we want to tackle this really important work. And so what is pretty fun, and I guess I'll go ahead and say we're busy implementing already. 2 weeks after the City Council approved our preservation plan, they approved our first 2 items. One was to modify our ordinance to establish criteria for a local ordinance district. We didn't have that available. There was not a clear path in our code if somebody wanted to be having those local historic zoning protections. So we built that path. And we're really pleased to have that approval. And then also we updated our ordinance for our Historic District Commission. We wanted to make sure that We met all of the criteria for a successful certified local government program, including our commissioner qualifications. And we also got clarity with our city council that the council does assign the review and recommendation of historical markers to the council. We've had a lot of requests for historical markers. Again, people want ways to tell those stories. They want to learn the stories of their community. And so we're making a way for that to happen also. And so the Historic District Commission will start considering marker ideas as early as in 2 days, which is also really exciting and something that I'm looking forward to. So that concludes my presentation today. Thank you, Bertha Cook, for being my historic preservation spirit animal. You know, when we talk about women in historic preservation and recognize the work that they do, I think it's also really fun to have those photos. And this person in particular has just always really fascinated me. I don't know what she grew up to become, but I imagine she was quite something. And so here we are in 1908 Georgetown getting ready for the Firemen's Parade. And here I am 115 years later, being able to continue on telling these stories and sharing these with you know, the community I find myself in. So if you do have any questions or want to follow up, need to know more information about how we did our historic preservation plan, I'd be glad to answer. Please give me a call or an email. And so Rachel, I'll turn things back over to you. And again, thank you so much for having me. What an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Britin, very much. Excellent job. Okay, I'll give y'all a few minutes. If anyone thinks, you've got lots of people thanking you and telling you wonderful job, of course. But if anybody has questions for Britin, you've got time to put them in the chat or the Q&A. Let's see here. People enjoyed hearing about your path to preservation. Thanks for the work you're doing. Everybody's saying thank you. Okay, well, I'll give people a chance to think of a question if they've got it. And then in the meantime, I'll ask a couple questions. Can you talk more about, are there efforts currently to establish a local ordinance district in any of Fayetteville's residential neighborhoods?
Oh, absolutely. Good question. So we're really, really well known for our Washington Willow National Register Historic District. It's a very large district. It includes hundreds of properties. And there was an attempt a few years ago, and we're kind of in that like pre-COVID, are we really in post-COVID era? So that was a difficult transition for everybody. So before we had to start dealing with COVID, we had city staff working with the neighborhood to see, okay, are y'all to the point that you want a historic district in that you're going to actually sign a petition? Like, we're really going to take that very formal step that we've been advised we need to take so that we're confirming that, yes, indeed, we do have the number of people kind of saying, yes, we want this, and that we wouldn't be telling our city council, well, we want to do this, but the residents don't want anything to do with it, right? There's hardly a city council that would want to do this without a lot of support from a neighborhood, I think. And so we couldn't get the petition signatures is really where it came down to. And then with COVID and people, you know, being separated, that presented its own challenges for communication and connection as well. So, you know, I think there's a lot of challenges with that particular effort. One is just the size of the district. It was so big, and that's a lot of very different needs to try to address at the same time. So what we're doing right now is thank you again to AHPP for supporting us with CLG grants. It's been really incredible to be able to work with their staff and to be able to work on projects with them. We are going to undertake a historic context statement project with the University Heights and Haskell Heights neighborhoods. So if you're familiar at all with Fayetteville, those are the neighborhoods around Markham Hill and directly west of the university campus. So they're kind of to the west of Razorback Road. And those are neighborhoods where we have everything from historic farmhouses to mid-century modern houses designed by very famous Fayetteville School of Architecture faculty. And so there's Fay Jones houses in that neighborhood, for example. There are houses designed by Warren Seagraves. And so we want to take a very close look, and the neighborhood's been petitioning for this for a while. We want to take a very close look at what historic resources we actually have. And do we have enough for a National Register district, or do we really need to look at more like a multiple property documentation form? something that acknowledges that maybe the neighborhood is kind of a geographic area is not quite where it needs to be for the National Register, but maybe there are certain collections of properties that can meet that criteria successfully. And while we're doing that, we're going to be working with the neighborhood to understand, do they want the protections that would come with a local ordinance district? And they have at the moment some of the highest, I think, redevelopment pressures because they're so close to the university. We have so many students coming in. The university population continues to increase really rapidly. Last year, we had just over 1,800 additional students enrolled. We're not sure what that number is going to be this year, but we need houses and people want to build them close to campus. The other thing is people are really focused on the short-term rental business and how close those neighborhoods are to the football stadium. And there's a lot of concerns about the impact that has on historic fabric that we're trying to look at ways to mitigate. So we think that that's going to be potentially our next big opportunity to look at a local ordinance district and work with the neighborhood. And I think that's probably a better scale for us to look at. And I really appreciate that in Arkansas, you don't have to have contiguous properties to do that because that neighborhood has such a diversity of housing types and ages that while the multiple property documentation form might be a great approach, so might kind of that non-contiguous approach to a local district. So fingers crossed for me that we'll have success there for sure.
Yeah, I hope so. Okay, let's see. Some questions. Will the Historic Preservation Plan provide guidance for establishing historic districts? And will there be another effort to get the petition signatures in Washington Willow?
We got a little bit of guidance in the plan, but most of our guidance for the local ordinance districts comes directly from state law. And it's so nice in Arkansas, the state lays out pretty much exactly what you have to do. With our ordinance change for the historic, or kind of with the Historic District Commission last month, we put a little bit more content into our code about what that looks like, but a lot of it's really going to be, give me a call. So definitely give me a call. As far as whether we're going to pursue Washington Willow again, I don't have a lot of people asking for it. I don't have people coming to me saying, we'd like to try this again. In fact, when we were at the farmers market, I did talk to a number of people who were concerned we were trying to force that upon them again. And I had to reassure people that's not what we were there to do. We were just voting with colored stickers. So no, we're not here to pose a threat. What I would be very interested in if we had a smaller group of property owners that were maybe not the entire National Register district, but maybe something more concentrated and who we really would have a lot of support in that group together. I think we would definitely want to look at that if somebody with their neighbors thought, this is something we'd really like to look at. And again, conversations are very easy. I'm always happy to help talk people through what that could look like. And I think we have a lot of options available, but sometimes it's easier to share with a couple of dozen people than with a few hundred, for sure.
Yeah, and you're right. Sometimes it's easier for people to get on board or be even interested or open to the idea if they've seen it done successfully somewhere else. Okay, at least this goes. Is any of your strategic planning involved with how to share historic properties with visitors to inform and educate, like as an architectural tourism?
Oh, yes, that is a really good question. So there are two parts that we're trying to figure out right now. One is how we have resources online and how we make those easy to access. So we've got a really cool, really great historic sites map online that uses GIS technology to power it. I haven't tested it on mobile actually, and I really need to do that because that's one of our one of our more traditional ways that we're approaching getting that information online. But that map itself needs a serious update and overhaul. We need a lot more content, information, updated photos, all kinds of stuff there. So we're working with our Historic District Commission to see what it is that they think we need to get online and how. So that'll be one aspect of it. How do you find us online and make that easy? And the other is working through what a coordinated historic marker program looks like so that when you're in Fayetteville, you can see a historic marker. You can understand very easily that, oh, this is the city telling the city story. And then also, how do you know how to go from that marker to another marker? How do you connect these things? Can we use QR codes to do that? So those are all things that we're talking about right now. We started talking about it kind of more in a more focused way last month, and we're going to continue those conversations in a couple of days and then probably through the rest of the year. So I don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, because a lot of our work is driven by our commissioners and how they want to approach things. But everybody's thinking really hard about what success would look like. And I think it's going to be a combination of physical things and online things for us, which is honestly really cool.
Thank you. So in general, why is it important for a city to even have a preservation plan? Why do this?
Besides the fact that it's just super fun, and I love public meetings, it was really important for us to understand what historic preservation looks like for Fayetteville. I think historic preservation has to be unique to your community. And I think one of the best ways to capture that is to go through a planning process with your community and say, for us, for example, we don't have all of these historic properties protected by historic zoning. And you would expect that we would, because that's traditionally how that's done. And so if Fayetteville didn't want to pursue that really robustly, what do we want to do? And for Fayetteville, it looked a lot like we want education, we want resources, we want programming, and we want to tell and celebrate our stories that are really important to us. And so that's what we're going to focus on for the time being. But also for us too, this was a really important way for us to focus what kind of asks we're going to make for grant funded projects, because that's such a critical source of funding for us. And so what is our what does the community say are important projects for us to do that we can then prioritize for grant funding and make sure that we're doing that in a well-organized way that's making the best use of that resource. And then when you're working with the city council, it's always really good to say, see, here in the plan, it says we should do this. This is why we're coming to you to ask for money to do this. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing over the next several months.
Yeah, you got to work the plan.
Got to work the plan, got to implement the plan.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Britin. Is there anything else you'd like to add in closing?
Arkansas it's such a beautiful place, and it's such a unique place. And the fact that you can see that so easily reflected in our communities across Arkansas is just endlessly fascinating to me. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share a little bit of my work. And I'm excited to also continue to connect to other historic preservation, professionals and people who maybe not would call themselves a professional, but are super interested. It takes all of us together doing this work, and I'm just excited to learn more from my Arkansas community of preservationists.
Thank you. That's a perfect thing to end with, and we're glad that you're here in Arkansas.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you again, Britin, and thank you all for watching. We'll see you next month. Bye.